Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. I'm delighted to be here at Harvard at the Center for International Development for what looks like it's going to be a very interesting and exciting day full of inspiring ideas. As you'll see from the pack in front of you, one purpose of this opening panel is to answer the question, why are we here? Don't worry, you haven't wandered by accident into a philosophy conference. You're in the right place. As you know, there's wide variety of perspectives on this issue on inclusive growth. At the opening event last night, we heard from Larry Summers, perhaps with more of a focus on developed economies and on what's happening in the US. The focus of today, of course, is more development. And I'm joined today by three very distinguished panelists who are going to discuss what inclusive growth is and how inclusive growth can be leveraged to address the most pressing problems in development. On my left here is Yuwa Hedrick-Wong, who is Chief Economist and Chair of the Academic Advisory Council at the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. Richard Samans is a member of the Managing Board of the World Economic Forum and leads the forum's initiatives on major global challenges. And finally, Ricardo Hausmann needs no introduction as our host here at the Center for International Development, where he is the director. So I just wanted to start by pointing out that I think it's worth noting that these are quite troubling times in some respects for emerging markets from a macroeconomic perspective. Emerging markets are being squeezed on the one hand by economic slowdown driven by a slowdown in China, and on the other hand by the prospect of rising interest rates in the US and the associated destabilizing capital outflows. I think the temptation amid macroeconomic turmoil is to immediately ask the question, how should we push for growth? Perhaps the better question is, how should we push for inclusive growth? And is inclusive growth more sustainable and less vulnerable to these worldwide trends? Yuwa, I know that that's a point you've made, or you've made a similar point in one of your reports. Perhaps you can start by telling us what you think inclusive growth is and why MasterCard is interested in it.
Right. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. By the way, I actually think the prospects of emerging markets are looking very good, but that's a different discussion. Let me begin by explaining why we're here, we being the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. The center is an independent subsidiary created by MasterCard, the business, the company. It's less than 2 years old. We tasked with a very ambitious mandate of advancing thought leadership on how globalization can become more inclusive, especially through advancing economic freedom for the poor. The name was chosen actually after a very intense internal debate. The original proposal was called the Center for Financial Inclusion, which clearly resonates very well with the core businesses of MasterCard. But some of us, myself included, fought tooth and nail and argued the case that we should really focus on the bigger challenge of inclusive growth. So the naming of the center actually turned on a deeper discussion on what is more appropriate, effective in tackling the global challenge of widening disparity between some countries and especially between segments of the society within countries. Now, I think there's no question that financial inclusion is very useful. That the poor tend to lack access to financial services, and these financial services can make their lives a lot better. Just imagine if all the micro entrepreneurs can have easier access to credit and investment capital, many more of them would be more successful, no doubt about that. And the rank and file the poor, yeah, they can benefit from using electronic payments and its associated facilities, not least of which is to lessen the financial burden of being stuck in using cash and cash only, which is a very high cost for the poor instrument to use, and so on. So financial inclusion is useful, but I would argue that this narrower focus actually leaves a lot of really important and intriguing questions unanswered. Firstly, why are there such unmet needs that the market forces have yet to address? And more importantly, is the lack of financial inclusion a standalone issue that deserves special attention, or is it symptomatic of a much bigger challenge in economic development. So, I think that the answer to the first question, why are there such unmet demand, is relatively straightforward. I think typically in the provision of financial services, a fixed cost is incurred per customer. And the poor being poor, they typically cannot generate sufficient business volume to justify the fixed cost per customer served. So they're trapped in a way in a vicious circle. So they're poor, they cannot access financial services, even though the financial services can really improve their income and livelihood and so on. But such a trap, let's call it a poverty trap, exists beyond financial services. In general, I would argue that the poor lack, and paraphrase the term used by Ricardo, they lack access to a wide range of really critically important networks that are the prerequisite today, I think, for anyone, everyone in this room included, to perform at the true potential. And some of these networks got to do with physical infrastructure, like the chart, the slide that you just saw, that has to do with urban transport, road, water, power, internet connections, and so on. The others are more institutional in nature, labor market, property rights, health and education, and financial services. Yet there's some others that are less defined, more intangible, but no less important, like social, personal, business, professional networks and connections. And from this perspective, poverty is caused by people being stuck at low levels of productivity relative to their true potential, because they lack access to this very important network. So inclusive growth, as far as I'm concerned, is all about enabling access to these networks so people can perform at the true potential. So this is sort of the task that we set ourselves, and the center. We hope we can sort of ignite the power of ideas, and I think that's what we're trying to do here. And let me just conclude by quoting John Maynard Keynes, who talked about, he talked about everything, but about the power of ideas too. And in his inimitable way, and he said, and I quote, in the closing pages of his general theory, the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they're right and when they're wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Practical men who believe themselves quite exempt from intellectual inferences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scrupulous of a few years back, unquote. Mm-hmm. So I hope we can be here to unleash the power of ideas, the right ideas, for it to reach the right people, the right places, such that we all, over time, will come to embrace inclusive growth as the way forward.
I always love a good Keynes quote. I'll have to drop that into the opening of one of my articles.
Thank you.
So thanks for that. I think all three of our panelists have views on how the agenda needs to be broadened. In your case, it was beyond just financial services. Richard, you have said that institutions are extremely important as the driver of inclusive growth, but that economic policymakers must broaden their priorities in order to make growth inclusive. Can you elaborate on that view?
Yes, and I'm rapidly trying to think which defunct economist I'm imprisoned by in my thinking. Probably quite a number of them.
Yeah, I imagine there's no shortage of candidates.
Indeed. In fact, I think Keynes is one of those defunct economists that we would benefit by being a little bit further under the spell of.
Mm-hmm. He's rolling over in his graves now.
In the sense that I think, as Jennifer demonstrated in our little summary of our work last night, and as I alluded to in the opening session, I happen to think that we had a more balanced growth model, which was pretty well received wisdom decades ago. And my personal view is that we have somewhat forgotten about that, about the role of this very wide spectrum of what I call institutions, but is what really means not only formal institutions, but policy incentives, enabling environment conditions, public administrative capacity, rules, the complex of these things in a range of different areas that Jennifer described. And this was, as I mentioned, what we learned out of the last financial crisis in the advanced countries, in Europe and the US in particular, is we effectively rebalanced our growth model following the high concentration of wealth and income coming out of the 19th century, and which was very acutely in evidence in the 20s here in this country. But I'm not just referring to the New Deal reforms in the 30s and the 40s. I'm referring, in fact, as Summer said last night, to a wave of institutional reforms that began with Teddy Roosevelt, continued through Franklin Roosevelt, and moved right through Truman. For those of you who are American, who are aware of American history, this built out a whole range of social insurance, labor, fair competition in markets, infrastructure, public education, both you know, at the earlier levels as well as the tertiary levels, health benefits, unemployment insurance. I mean, a whole range of different areas, including the regulation of not just financial stability in the banking system, but also corporate governance, protection of small savers, a whole range of things that basically, you know, I don't want to use any term more too formally, but democratize the process of economic growth, and also diversified socially the outcomes of economic growth. And that had a very nice effect of cycling and recycling resources through the economy, raising consumption, aggregate demand, boosting middle class, and thereby lessening the economy's exposure to booms and bust, investment-driven booms and busts. Now, fast forward to today, after the last financial crisis, and we're still struggling to find a more balanced growth model, as everyone's worried that China is now decelerating in its growth, and the commodity support for many economies, commodity price support is lessening. We're back to talking about the need for rebalancing of both emerging market growth models, but also a way for some of the advanced economies to find a more balanced footing. These are essentially similar types of debates. The problem is, over the last 30 or 40 years, I think we forgot the equity part of the equation, by and large. And by that I mean we've had a very appropriate focus coming out of the 70s, and we had a lot of stagflation in this country and some slow growth elsewhere, on supply side reforms to improve efficiency. Most of them absolutely needed. And certainly coming out of the Vietnam War here in this country, we had fiscal policy that was out of whack. And we needed some adjustments in monetary policy too, given the inflation that happened. So macro policy and financial stability focus, these things are important. You need to keep your markets open to import know-how and to ensure that you've got a robust competitive environment that supports productivity growth. But that's, while necessary, not sufficient if the objective of the society is not just national income growth, but really the bottom line requirement for anybody running an economy is not growth per se, it's sustained broad-based progress in living standards. And so your opening question was, well, what do we mean by inclusive growth? To my way of thinking, what we mean fundamentally is indeed that, is sustained broad-based progress in living standards, which you might say includes a couple of components. One is, one proxy is median household income growth. Another one, though, is well-being, beyond just how much money income is in the pocket. There are other living standards aspects of living standards, of well-being of households beyond just their income, and also participation in the process of growth, which is, again, a proxy for that is gainful employment in some fashion. That's a very that's a related but different barometer of national economic success than GDP growth per se. And accordingly, there are very important levers beyond macroeconomic soundness, beyond openness, and beyond a stable financial system that are quite important. And these are the kinds of institutional areas that we're focusing on in this particular report. Maybe just to stop here, I would we're opening up with some general contextual remarks, and I'm speaking internationally. I know today is going to be focused mainly on two things, which is developing countries, number one, and second of all, we're focusing today less on the policy environment and more on the practice, which I think is terrific. So I want to maybe remark on that a little bit later in the panel, but for now, while we're sort of on the broad context setting, I would say that what this means, in effect, is a rebalancing or an expansion of the way we think about structural reform. Structural reform typically, as you will read about in the papers and you'll see the debates, has been mainly focused on the efficiency aspect of driving improved economic outcomes. Very important, necessary, in many cases, critically necessary, such as in Europe. But that's not sufficient in many, many societies which are, in fact, not getting a broad enough social participation in the process and benefits. And these other areas that we've gathered some cross-country data on are, in my view, also worthy of being considered structural reform or structural adjustment. We need to widen the lens, basically, by which we think about organizing our economies.
Anyone who's ever read an Economist leader will know that we're extremely keen on calling for structural reform in pretty much any economy at any time. So I will have to go back with this broadened message from the conference today. Ricardo, your definition of inclusive growth is particularly interesting because you define it in such a way as to purposefully exclude the role of redistribution. So for you, what is the central factor to including the poor in growth?
Well, first of all, I don't like the term inclusive growth to mean, growth is something like a bitter pill that you have to take, and inclusiveness is sort of like a chocolate coating to make it a little bit more palatable. Okay? I think that exclusive growth is just inefficient and slower, and that one way to broaden growth is by using more productively the human capabilities that a society has. And there must be some reason why those capabilities that the society has are not being used more efficiently. So in some sense, in my mind, you need a theory of why would that be the case. Why would sort of like the market outcome, the unperturbed outcome, be so inefficient? And in my mind, it's super inefficient. And here, at least in the countries that I study and the countries that I've been most involved in, which is the developing countries. By the way, let me just tell you a bit personal anecdote. I finished my PhD in 1981, just in time for the Mexicans to default on their debt and triggering a decade of debt crisis. Venezuela defaulted in February '83. And the signal event of my professional career was this debt crisis, inflation, exchange rate problems, banking crisis, debt crisis, and so on. So for the first, 15, 20 years of my career, I was obsessed about macroeconomic stability, improving things, and so on. And I think that the generation to which I belong in Latin America were successful beyond belief, except in my country. In terms of transforming the situation, going to investment grade, single digit inflation, incredible financial stability, central bank independence, whatever, you name it. The growth outcome of that was amazingly disappointing. If you had told me, conditional on the macro success, predict growth, I would have said, no, this place is going to boom, etc. And when all the stars were aligned, when the commodity prices were high, when everything was fine, growth was pitiful. So that led me to believe that there must be something more that we are not observing beyond the macro story. Yeah.
People are not listening to you.
Hello, is that right?
So you're facing that side.
Okay.
So your mic is there.
Is that better? No. Well, so so what is this thing that is preventing the economy from growing more? And here, let me tell you two defunct economist problems. The first defunct economist problem is that geography does not exist, space does not exist, right? So an economy is an economy. Talk Venezuela, talk Mexico, right? You look at Mexico, the state of Nuevo León is 9 times richer than the state of Chiapas. That obviously cannot be explained because of the Constitution of Mexico, because of the exchange rate of Mexico, because of the investment grade of Mexico, because of the banking system of Mexico, etc. So it's just that this process is happening in a very differential way across space. There must be a reason for that, right? Number two, we are trained as an economist to think that the world is composed of very few substances that are substitutes. The world is composed of capital, is composed of human capital, is composed of labor, and if you have too little capital and a lot of labor, you choose something that uses a lot of labor and little capital. If you have a lot of capital and little labor, use stuff that uses a lot of capital and little labor. So essentially, you're substituting among these substances, okay? My aha moment went from saying maybe the world is not composed about these few substances that are substitutes, but it's composed out of many, many inputs that are complements. A substitute is something like coffee and tea. A complement is something like coffee and sugar. The more coffee you have, the more sugar you need. And if you don't have sugar, you may not drink the coffee, right? So having a production function that means that you need many things to produce that are complements means that any missing piece has a devastating effect on the outcome, right? So as I was saying last night, if the lights go out, that's the end of this conference, right? If the internet goes out, that's the end of half of the work of this community here. So when you go out in space and ask yourself, I'm going to establish a company somewhere in Mexico, ask yourself, where in Mexico can I have power, water, roads to get in and out, urban transport for my workers to get in and out, security, access to other clients and customers and so on? Where in space can that happen? Well, in relatively few places. And in those places, the poor cannot afford to live. So they have to live 3 hours away, and they have to spend 4 hours, 5 hours a day commuting back and forth, and so on and so forth. That's the reality of production. So when you hear Larry Summers last time, he's essentially talking about a country where capitalism succeeded, in the sense that 8 out of 9 people in the US work for something you might want to call a capitalist firm. A firm that owns a means of production, hires the workers, and workers earn their living through a wage. If you go to Chiapas in Mexico, that's 1 out of 7 who live that way, because capitalism just did not diffuse in those spaces. So the question is, why can't the productivity that you're able to achieve in Nuevo León, is that unachievable in Chiapas? Why is Nuevo León 9 times more productive than Chiapas? It is because we cannot replicate in Chiapas what we are able to produce in Nuevo León. And in my mind, Yuwa mentioned, I think, the essential intuition of this alternative approach, and I think he's completely right. But it has some very important implications, if he's right. He has very important implications of how you want to think of the way forward. And I think that has everything to do with the papers, the 11 papers we're going to discuss today. The essential intuition is the following. You have this trap in the sense that to produce, you need access to many things, and unless you have access to everything, it will be very hard to be effective producing, okay? But having access to these things typically involves paying some fixed cost for gaining access to that thing, and once you pay that fixed cost, you face much lower variable costs, right? So if you are connected to the water network, you just turn the knob and water comes out. You're not connected to the water network, you have to go fetch the water, bring it back. You're connected to the electricity network, you flip the switch. You're not connected to the electricity network, you spend hours walking to a forest to carry wood and bring it back in. So the cost of using water, using electricity, using transportation, using information declines dramatically if you're connected. And it's super expensive if you're not. Okay? Now, you need to be connected to everything or to many things to be able to produce in a modern economy. So the trap that Yuwa was mentioning is that if you're going to be poor, it doesn't pay me to connect you. If you're going to have little money balances, it doesn't pay me to open you an account. If you're going to be using very little electricity, it doesn't pay me to connect you to the network. But then, if I don't connect you to the network, you will be unproductive and hence poor. So what we are really after is ways to solve that inefficiency. It's an inefficiency. It's a waste. It makes nobody richer. It makes nobody richer. There's no trade-offs here. It's just an inefficiency. And we have to find a way to get out of it. And the way to get out of it is through two means. One involves policy, the other one doesn't involve policy. The one that doesn't, they say that there is no policy or technology are the solution to all problems. The Kennedy School invented speed limits, and MIT invented the seatbelt. Right? So let's go first to technology. In India, cell phone penetration is upwards of 80%. Landline penetration is about 2%. You ask yourself, why is landlines 2% and cell phones 8%? Wrong answer, because landlines started later and they have not yet had time to diffuse. The check is in the mail. No, the check is not in the mail. It's because the fixed cost of connecting your home to the system through a copper wire is just too expensive for the low incomes. But if suddenly you can lower those fixed costs, boom, you get an increase, a huge expansion of the market. So what is the whole idea of micro-lending? Let's lower these fixed costs of connecting people to the financial market, and suddenly, bang, you get now the market developing. So one thing is lower the fixed costs. For example, we have this paper on the Nigerian Uber for the motorcycles. Now Chinese motorcycles are ubiquitous everywhere in Africa, but we don't use them efficiently because they don't have information of who needs what. So let's mix it with an Uber-like product, and now suddenly we can lower the fixed cost of finishing a logistics system that wasn't be otherwise. There's a fixed cost of figuring out if somebody's a good employee or not a good employee. So, Gretchen here is finding out a simpler way to find out if somebody is a good guy or not a good guy by playing a game. So she's lowering the cost of the fixed cost of figuring out if somebody is good or not to connect them to that information. And so technology is one way of addressing things. Ugo Panizza here is lowering the cost of connecting the poor or the middle class to the global capital market so that they can save more efficiently, and so on and so forth. So some of these innovations are about lowering the cost of connecting people to networks that would make them more efficient. The second one is policy. I am impressed by the fact that in 1775, 1 year before the Declaration of Independence, the Continental Congress decided to create the U.S. post system. And the U.S. post system started with a commitment of putting a post office in every incorporated city in the land at a sort of like a fixed rate. That means that there's a fixed cost of installing a point in that network, but that we will pay collectively so that everybody is in the network. We somehow agree to share the fixed cost of extending that network. The postal system was the internet of their time. It started with the idea that everybody, every region had to have full access to the network, and that there had to be some way of collectively paying for it. Now we have G3, G4 technology. G3, G4 technology is not diffusing fully because it doesn't pay, given whatever policies the governments have. So as David was explaining to me yesterday, in Brazil, you have 25% tariff rates on imported cell phones. You have, the government trying to maximize the revenue they get from bandwidth and so on and so forth. And as a consequence, the speed at which G3, G4 technology diffuses is impacted by things that affect, policy-wise, the cost of diffusing that network. So through policies that include people and networks, through policies or through strategies that change the fixed costs, we can make growth inclusive and hence better on a win-win-win basis. More efficiency, increases in productivity that are happening at the lower end of the distribution, so you get simultaneously growth with inclusion. I am not an enemy of redistribution. I think societies have to show their solidarity somehow. But from the point of view of solving this problem, it's a third best or a 17th best, because it's telling people, sorry, Charlie, I cannot use you productively, waste your life, you'll get compensated for it. And I think that is a horrible message.
If it is the case that the production function is actually very big, they're all complements, and as a result, missing any one of them can hamstring you, isn't that quite pessimistic, really, in that you would need to cast your net very broadly indeed, if every element is a sufficient condition to doing well. So I'm interested in how broad our measures of inclusive growth need to be. Richard, you've identified 15 domains that we should measure, including many kinds of non-traditional factors. So perhaps you could tell us how you came about thinking about those domains and which ones are missing, say, in the US today.
Well, we had to be honest, there was no theoretical or even beautifully elaborated empirical basis for identifying, the totality of the most important domains. I think we simply looked at the literature, at historical experience, and made some judgments on the ones that seemed to have a particular bearing. And so this is very much an art rather than a science, given the relatively immature state of scholarship in this area. And then secondly, we also just humbly decided to take a fairly, you might even say business-like approach, which is, all right, we don't exactly know all the theoretical underpinnings, we don't have perfect information about data, but let's see what we do have by way of cross-country information, and let's simply construct it in a way that enables benchmarking among reasonably like sets of countries. And that in and of itself might lead to a bit of a more concrete conversation. Now, to Ricardo's point, if you look at the 7 general domains that Jennifer described last night, 6 of them are really having to do with the way the market operates, or the enabling environment for market activity. The 7th is fiscal transfers, which is both the tax code and your social insurance and protection systems. So I heartily endorse Ricardo's view, and this is reflected in our framework, that it's very important to think long and hard about the various dimensions that do influence the robustness of growth and how broad the process is and the contours of its outcomes as well. But having said that, I take a little bit more sympathetic view of the utility in and of itself of fiscal transfers. I think there are just the human experience being what it is. Inevitably, societies are going to have people who are less capable, even if they've got all the necessary connectivity to succeed. And there's a dimension there about the spirit of a society wanting to bring everybody along. So in many cases, you really need to do that no matter what in this regard. I'm sure that you would not disagree with that.
Can I disagree?
Please do.
No, let's make a little bit more of a debate. You look across the world. We can look at their fiscal accounts. Egypt, Venezuela, or most countries. And you look how much money they spend in transfers and how much money they spend in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and so on and so forth. And you find out that countries spend much more money subsidizing electricity than they spend in education. They spend much more money subsidizing food in some places than they spend in the things that would have empowered people to become productive. So I think that while there is a debate in the US between people who want more redistribution or people who want less redistribution, I think that in many of the countries I work on, redistribution is eating into the meager resources that could have been invested empowering people to form part of a productive society. So I think that this issue of whether I think you need a tax base, you need to use that tax base for a purpose, but for countries that are poorer, the trade-off between incorporating people to make them more productive and hence future taxpayers versus compensating them for their lack of inclusion is killing the future. Is killing the future. So I think it's not a question of how soft our heart is. It's a question of how efficient we want to make the scarce resources of the government in terms of making a society that is more equal and more inclusive.
Yuwa, what do you think about this? MasterCard assigns every country an inclusive growth score. So what role does fiscal transfers play in that?
Well, forget all about that. You know, given you see the problem sitting here with Ricardo is that 10 minutes later I'm still thinking about what he just said. So sorry, I'm a bit slow. No, let me just reflect on two things, both what Richard said and Ricardo said. And earlier you asked a question about well, what range of ingredients are necessary for growth to be inclusive? Well, I think it's really a case by case. And also, in terms of the fiscal transfer, and you know what Richard said sort of triggered my mind thinking about, in the case of China, it's not fiscal transfer, but it's a fiscal reallocation that's creating more inclusive growth. It's very, very interesting. So with the disparity in terms of geography, the urban versus rural, in the last 10 years, there's a fiscal reallocation of faster investment in rural areas in all the infrastructure that Ricardo's talking about. So they are now in a stage where instead of moving people from poor areas from low productivity areas to high productivity areas, like our work that we collaborated with the National Institute of Economic Research in Beijing shows that you take a peasant in random with no additional training and put the same individual in a construction site, his productivity is about 3 times overnight. And if the same individual, you take her from this rural village to a manufacturing factory, it's 5 times. Okay, so that's what that's really what happened in China. But today, because of the fiscal reallocation, this massive investment in rural areas, the rural productivity is rising. So instead of people moving, they move productivity. So it's a very interesting case, you know, from their point of view. But I think Richard sort of made me think about the big historical backdrop to this kind of policy swing. You know, again, using China as an example. I really think, I don't know how you feel about this, I really think Xi Jinping, the current president, is trying to be the Teddy Roosevelt of the US. They had a huge, you know, robber baron, you know, get rich fast period. And he's trying to really tame it, control it, and hence all this anti-corruption drive, and you know, so that is important because that's leaders are worried about this. Okay, we have yet to, you know, we understood and absorb, you know, the kind of groundbreaking thinking that Ricardo is talking about. So we stuck with different defunct economists, you know. And that's what we see now in the world, is that swing, you know. And finally, you can have massive transfer, and you end up with massive disasters. I really think Greece is the case in point. If you look at the pre-crisis Greek economy, I don't know how it would look applying your, you know, all the indicators. every single Greek got rich massively, regardless of their productivity, because money is cheap and the government's spending rose to over 50%, over 50% GDP because of the massive transfer. So that's an abject lesson that we have to keep in mind. Anyway, so it's enough for me.
Maybe just to close this redistribution piece of the discussion off here. You're certainly right that a lot of fiscal resources gets wasted by being spent on inefficient and often, frankly, regressive subsidies, as you mentioned. But most people, when they think about fiscal transfers in the context of this debate, they're thinking about public health, they're thinking about some basic retirement, basic unemployment. This is a critical issue in the following sense, and you can see this in a number of emerging markets right now, including China. You know, in the absence of some minimum level of basic services and protection, people have to save more. That leaves less to consume. And that means, as you can see, it has been plaguing China for the last 10, 20 years or so. You got an excessively high amount of savings, and that ends up residually requiring much greater degree of emphasis on export production. And that's exactly the rebalancing challenge that we have right now. And so properly, one might say belatedly, but properly, the Chinese government is beginning to focus here, and it has the fiscal space to do so. Another aspect of this, just quickly, is to take the case of Brazil, where Brazil has made some significant gains in its fight against inequality by innovating and providing some direct cash transfers, sometimes linked to educational access and attendance, of very poor people living in slums. Again, these are the kinds of things that create the basic conditions for people to engage. Yes, there are other steps that need to be taken to improve their connectivity to markets, but there is a role, I think a proper role. I mean, strangely last night, Larry Summers suggested that I was downplaying the significance of redistribution, and here I may be sounding like I'm overemphasizing it, but the point is that it's neither. In our view, it is a bona fide aspect of the strategy. It's just not the only aspect, and there are multiple others, including a number of areas that are critical for innovation, the intermediation of savings to real economy investment, corruption, avoiding concentration of rents, ethics, a range of things that are thought of less about labor and social democratic, if you will, priorities, and more about conservative or business-oriented priorities. And that's why what we were referring to in saying that in some ways the debate quickly gets a little too polemicized. People tend to see things in black or white. In our view, if what you're really serious about in invoking this mantra, and it is a mantra of inclusive growth, if what you're really serious about is managing the economy for bottom line success, namely broad-based progress and living standards, you got to have a wider toolbox than focusing on financial stability, macroeconomic prudence, and openness to the world economy. These are necessary but not sufficient.
Henry, can I ask Ricardo a question?
Please do.
Yeah. Ricardo, following your sort of the conceptual model of productivity, is there a case where certain individuals fully connected to all the ingredients necessary for them to perform at their optimal level, and yet it's considered by the society, Richard, what's your term, the well-being, living in insufficient well-being, that they need transfer, subsistence, is that,
Look, there are 1,000 reasons why people need transfers. They may be incapacitated, they may be sick, they may be old. A society is a place where people live together. We have to be, we are each brother's keeper. So there has to be a chapter of redistribution in any society. I think that's beyond discussion. Whether it's good for growth, bad for growth, you will do it anyway because it's your values, and there are things more important than growth, after all, right? So, what I would like is to have that discussion separate from the discussion of what was the original reason why the economy, without perturbation, would have become so unequal. And is that outcome sort of like efficient, good, or bad?
Right,
and if
right.
that outcome is bad, what are the things you have to start doing to compensate it? Now, conditional cash transfers is sort of like Latin America's gift to the world. It's sort of like started in Mexico and Venezuela. The Mexicans got it all, you know, with randomized controlled trials, this, that, and the other. So then it was copied by the Brazilians, and now the World Bank is sort of like mimicking it everywhere in the world. I have no problem in some sense with conditional cash transfers, only to remind ourselves that, you know, the provision of infrastructure in Brazil is dismal, and that the bulk of the reduction in poverty in Brazil has nothing to do with conditional cash transfers, has everything to do with growth and so on, that is now in peril because the commodity price boom is gone and so on. So this inclusive growth is not in the recreation of growth with redistribution or growth with equity, or in some sense how we constrain growth so that it will be more equitable. It is really a way of enhancing growth in a way that makes more people productive, and consequently that generates a more equal society.
And what role does education have to play in that? Because you don't see traditional education goals as a key factor.
Yeah, well, I mean, what do they say? Many a beautiful theory has been killed by an ugly fact. You know, the world thought that universal effort to, you know, massify education was going to transform the world. And that experiment was run over the last 50 years. And, you know, schooling levels of the labor force in the world have essentially tripled over the last 50 years. And when you look at the returns of those investments, they are dismal. I mean, for example, in Turkey, Turkey in 2010 had about twice the average years of schooling as the Netherlands in 1960. And, you know, 3, 5, multiple times more university graduates than the Netherlands had in 1960. Okay? It was actually more urbanized. Fertility rates were lower than in the Netherlands in 1960. In all socio-demographic indicators, Turkey was more advanced than the Netherlands in 1960. Okay? Plus, Turkey had access in 2010 to the internet, to cell phones, to antibiotics, to computers, to a bunch of things that the Netherlands did not have in 1960. How does Turkey's income in 2010 compare with the Netherlands in 1960? The Netherlands was twice as rich. Twice as rich. So there is a humongous thing that is not in those variables. It's a first order thing. It's multiples. 50 years of technological improvement. Multiples of human capital investment. And they were still twice as rich. So that is to me the puzzle. That is to me and that's what has been sort of like driving our research agenda. And what we find is that technology, or that education, so we have been thinking of education in terms of how much does each person know, how many years did he spend in school, and since quality might be different, well, how many years of PISA corrected, standardized test corrected outcomes. And we find that that's not where the action is. That where the action is how different do people know. Not how much do they know, but how different do they know. Because in order to make a complicated product, you need people who know about different things, right? If you're going to play a symphony, you need the violins, the violas, the timpani, the cello, whatever. So you need to be able to put together a team with diverse skills. And Frank Nefke, who must be somewhere, is doing research that shows that a lot of the returns to your education depends on how complementary are the things you know with the things that other people you work with know. So at least, the bulk of the increase in this thing that is making the U.S. more unequal, which is the college premium, The fact that the college premium has gone up, so the wage gaps between high school students and university students have gone up, is coming from the fact that people are working with other people who know things that are different from what they know and that they can complement themselves at work. Okay? So that means that in some sense productivity is in the ecosystem. It's not in the individual. It's not just about investing in the individual, it's about minding the ecosystem in which those individuals are operating.
We've nearly run out of time, so I'll let you have the final word on that, Richard. Do you agree with Ricardo's views on education?
No, not entirely. I mean, in part. Again, this is one of these nuanced things. I hate for this discussion to go into a kind of a black and white mode. What you say has validity up to a point in certain circumstances, but it's also true that raising a basic level of literacy has all sorts of spillover benefits in very poor societies. You can't really, and secondly, as our research shows, because we've been able to take a look at a range of not just the absolute level of enrollment or access, but we have distributional data in societies. And you can see that part of the widening dispersion of outcomes in society, in this country in particular, but many others as well, is because the system does a very poor job of giving a roughly equal degree of educational opportunity. And so, yes, you need complementary skills in the workplace, but basically, if you're condemning large swaths of the population who come from lower income households to inferior education such that they don't really have the opportunity to diversify into exactly the spots where you need the complementary skills, I think we're storing up trouble for inequality in society. So it's a partial yes and a partial no, if you will.
Just a two-handed.
We're nearly out of time.
Just a statistic. If you take the countries in 1960, where the labor force had completed primary, 6 years of schooling on average, 6 years of schooling, their average income was $10,000. If you take the countries that today have 6 years of schooling, on average in their labor force, their average income is $1,000. So we have converged to those levels of education. We are nowhere near as converging to those levels of income because there are many important things. I agree that education can always be a good, and I'm in the business, so. But it just gives you the magnitude of what's not there.
Well, I think we've run out of time, so thank you very much, everybody.